First of all, thank you, E.T., for this invite. Always a pleasure to come back into healthcare events and have a little bit of a conversation. What I see in front of me over here are Bangalore's brightest, senior-most clinicians whom I have admired for the last 28 years that I've been in healthcare. So a lot of the learning that I've sort of picked up here in this city actually sits with many interactions that have happened over here. So thank you very much for all the guidance and for being there as we were building enterprises in this city. Just before I came here, I had almost a deep dive with Dr. Banker, and that is my induction into IVF. So I don't profess to know this field. I don't profess to really understand this field. I'm just sort of getting in here with a little bit of thought in terms of what can be done in an area which probably promises to be one of the brightest growth agendas for healthcare perspective, but also from an industry perspective. And when we look at obstetrics, gynecology, and women's health, this is probably one of the fastest growing sectors as one can see around the world. So a little bit of why the race for parenthood is so bright. I'm sure that this is not something that people don't know, but I think it just sort of helps to set the context that the reason why we believe that IVF as a procedure, IVF as a technology, IVF as an opportunity to create a whole new ecosystem will rise is basically because of this massive fall in fertility rate that's happening around the world. India is no exception to this. A country which we all believe is so overly populated is actually having an issue in terms of people having babies is definitely a little bit of a dichotomy. But it's all happening in front of us over here, and that's why we believe that there is an opportunity to do something very, very different in this space. Obviously, this is again something from the UN Sustainable Goals. Number of children that women are going to have has progressively decreased over a period of time. It's only going to get worse as the years go by. So therefore, the need to be in this sector and try and be helpful and try and create something which will actually bring about some degree of change. Ever since the time I started to look at Nova, and as you all know that we recently acquired Nova, the IVF business at AHH, which is Asia Healthcare Holdings, I've been reading a lot about this space. And every now and then, the amount of media attention that is going behind creating babies, I never really thought that there is so much of attention that the world is actually giving to this entire agenda of growing infertility rates, and therefore how tough it is going to be to have babies in the future. So Time actually carried this, and this is a January 2019 article. And I would request all of you to sort of just pull it out and take some thoughts around it, because it just takes you to a very, very different world, not necessarily around infertility and fertility treatment, but basically around how the whole ecosystem is going to expand and change in a very short period of time. And obviously, technology will have a lot to do with it. This is The Economist. And obviously, since I stand in front of you over here, money, commercial, private equity, investment will all become a part of this whole conversation. But the question, therefore, is that never before has this sector received so much of external attention. Never before have we actually listened to so much which is happening around this sector worldwide, that it actually opens up our eyes around what we should be doing here in this part of the world to make IVF a more penetrated specialty, particularly for this 1.3 billion country. The reason I'm trying to show you this is also the reason why, because I'm sure every second, third day, you read about some transaction or the other going on, right? And it's become very normal for everybody to turn around and say, okay, so where is the next investment going to happen in healthcare? The reason I'm trying to show you this is to take your attention to the fact that around the world, these were actually the largest transactions that happened in 2018. The number one was in healthcare. If you see across all the other industries, other sectors, media, telecom, energy, food, financial services, the world is represented here in terms of the various sectors that actually power the world. It's all sitting over here. But when you look at healthcare and when you look at the number of transactions that happen in healthcare, it is actually double of its nearest second, which also goes to show that a lot of capital is being put behind healthcare, has traditionally been put behind healthcare, and a lot of what we see in the healthcare world, particularly in this country, has been powered on the back of private equity. The reason being that if we continue to spend on public healthcare 1.2% of our GDP, somebody has to come in and put capital to work so that all of us can get better healthcare. And that's exactly what's happening in this world right now, where more and more private capital is going in to actually expand and create a much better ecosystem. That does not necessarily mean that it is all about economics, but it is also about the fact that when you come in, you also create better enterprises, you create better clinical outcomes, you create better clinical technology, you actually fund the entire ecosystem. And that's exactly what this is all about. So if you take a look at the global IVF market, it's supposed to be in the region of about 21.6 billion US dollars. So it's not a small industry. It's not a small sector. It's a reasonably large sector. And it is not just about IVF services, but you have to basically take a look at the entire ecosystem, which actually powers this industry, which actually powers this sector. And so there is activity which is happening right from bottom up, from the time that you actually start seeing technology to the services side right on top. And there is no geography of the world which is actually left untapped over here. Let's come back to India and let's also look at on the services side, which is the work that all of us do. Relative to the 21-odd billion dollars, this is just 10%. But this is what really makes the impact. People don't know about technology, right? My friends who are actually going through IVF services right now, they don't understand technology. They understand the front end of the service, which is actually about helping them get a baby. So that's part of the sector is currently growing at about 8% between 2018 and 2023. That's the kind of growth that we're going to see as far as the IVF services are concerned. This is what is really interesting. India is going to create a much higher proportion of that growth. So between 2018 and 2028, which is the kind of horizon that all of us look at, particularly in the world of investments, we basically look at a 5-year, 10-year kind of a horizon. This is what is going to happen as far as India is concerned. So we basically believe that we are at the tip of the iceberg as far as this specialty is concerned. We believe that what has happened over the last 10, 15, 20 years has actually created a very good foundation for more and more companies to emerge out of this science, for better quality of care to emerge out of all that has happened behind these enterprises. And more than everything else, trying to basically help the Indian IVF opportunity grow much larger in the coming years. Anuj actually talked about 100,000 cycles. You see that number over there. We expect that to be 3x in a very short period of time, and probably the full potential of the work that all of us are sitting and doing over here would be in the region of about 280,000 cycles. So we are talking about an ecosystem in this part of the world which is actually going to grow a lot more. I think the big question for all of us, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, is numbers talk a very different language, but what we need to do on the ground is something which is very, very different, right? Unfortunately, in the world of numbers, you can tend to get lost in the growth opportunity, but what the Indian healthcare ecosystem is going through right now requires a very, very different kind of a mindset and requires a very different approach to actually run healthcare enterprises. I think this is so critically important around this business. And pardon me for calling it a business, but this is what it is, right? Because when you look at parents, and when you look at parents who want to have a child, there's two things of financial or geographic influence actually tend to go away. And unfortunately, what remains behind and what gets often talked about is the entire financial side of having gone through an IVF process and not come out of it very successfully. So how many people and how many parents in this country will be able to really afford the price points as we move forward and as we want to penetrate this specialty more and more in this country? We need to do a lot more around the space to make it more affordable. We need to do a lot more in this space where success rates go anywhere from 50% to 60% or even less at times. And the number of mothers and fathers who cannot become parents, for them to have the accessibility to do the second and the third and the fourth time. So I think that's really what we need to look from a perspective of that, is Indian healthcare really ready for the way that we actually want to approach it? So let me now take you through a couple of issues. There is a fundamental change in the way that healthcare is being delivered in this country today. And it's got nothing to do with IVF, but it's got to do something with the sector per se. There is a consolidation across the value chain, and as you read more and more about it, you will have a better appreciation around it. So exactly what we're doing today at AHH is actually trying to put together the opportunity of various companies to come on our platform and grow. That's consolidation. And the reason why this consolidation is happening is basically because a lot of early stage enterprises have not been able to push their agenda of growth with sustainable outcomes. And when I say sustainable outcomes, it could be financial, and also it could be non-financial from their sustainability perspective. So we'll see a lot more of this happening in this space. And the reason I will take you through are also because the economics of this sector have changed and have got actually disfigured for a very, very long period of time. So changes to the regulatory environment, whether we call it Ayushman Bharat or we call it any other word. For the first time, regulation is actually coming and hitting the Indian healthcare sector in a much bigger way than many of us actually envisaged for a very, very long period of time. And this is just the beginning. This is going to be very, very deep-rooted. So for many of us who've been used to running enterprises in a manner where nothing really mattered, suddenly we'll find ourselves in a situation where everything begins to matter. And particularly, it is not just about the way that we're going to get priced, but it is also with the way things are coming out, and particularly our sector over here is currently in a big lens of the government and of trying to basically come under that lens in terms of what is it that's going on in this sector which can be regulated. So something for us to really think about whether our enterprises are fit enough to be taken for granted by regulation, and whether we are taking regulation for granted also. Shrinking margins across the industry. Over the last 6 quarters, this sector particularly has lost margin on a quarter-on-quarter basis. Healthcare shares today of most of the leading companies are at an all-time low. And the reason being, again, are all these regulatory pressures which have begun to hit the sector and have taken away a large portion of the value. And the reason being that many of these entities have not been able to recover from this push because they were never ready and we were never ready. So I think it is my intention here this evening to actually sensitize everybody sitting over here that we are going to be facing very different headwinds. And it's important for each one of us, particularly the ones who are running large enterprises, medium enterprises, even smaller practices, that we come in connection with the regulatory world and try and make a change. Evolving customer preferences. I talked to you about financial and geographic world in terms of when people actually want to have babies, they will go and do anything to make it happen. I think what is more important is that the customer finally is beginning to have a say. And the digital world is the one which has actually thrown up many of these possibilities. It's not just about putting up a website. It is not just about being in social media. But it is also about that you can receive a high and you can receive a low on the same day. So never before have we in healthcare experienced so much of this external interference in the way that we are judged by an external community. That is becoming a massive push around the way that people and customers are showing their preference for where they want to go and where they don't want to go. Demographic shifts in key markets, technological advances, this all sits in the fundamental shift of the market per se. And living that life, I can tell you it is tough. For almost 3 decades of my life, I've spent trying to build healthcare enterprises. And I know for the first time that these are very tectonic shifts. So leading operational indicators, we can see volumes and payer mix shifting. Insurance is becoming a big play. The moment insurance becomes a big play, we get into a very different conversation. For the first time, and I'm sure that those of you who also practice obstetrics, you will know that when you start talking to GIPSA, which is supposed to be the insurance body which actually gives approvals on pricing, GIPSA today is talking of obstetrics starting price points at 30,000 rupees. You would have never even thought that this birthing packages will be at 30,000 rupees. And they are actually delisting enterprises who are not offering these price points to them. The question is that you're in an environment where you can't do anything about. Because all that they will come and tell you is either you accept this price point or don't accept it. Now, whether this entity can take it or not take it is a question that doesn't even get answered. So big shifts happening in the payer mix. And we need to get ready as enterprises for this shift. If insurance is going to be a big play for us, our entire cost structures have to shift. Our entire cost structures have to change. Our entire enterprise value needs to shift so that we're in a much better position to take low price points. Rising administrative costs, healthcare people cost is jumping 10%, volumes are increasing 6%. Price impact is reducing 5%. The crocodile model has never been so sharp. Everything goes up like this, volumes come down, and what happens to these enterprises? So the question therefore is that there is a shift, and we need to recognize that shift and try and grapple with it in terms of what is it that we can really do to create sharper, nimble, agile organizations. Declining productivity and rising input costs. Srinivas is here. Our pharmaceutical costs are not really decreasing year on year, right? So all our input costs are actually increasing because that's a function of the costs that they have to incur for yearly production and people and everything that goes along with it. So we are in an ecosystem where everybody's cost points are shifting, and they will get translated to us as an enterprise. Organizational indicators of distress is when I look at the last 20 years, and when I look at people, when I look at teams, when I look at connectivity of people to their organization, and when I look at attrition. For a very long period of time in healthcare, we had people who would stay in organizations for a long period of time, right? This was one sector which actually held a lot of pride that people stood in their organizations for a long period of time. That is shifting. Attrition levels are at 30%, which effectively means that people are rolling across, searching for a new place to go and anchor themselves. Not good for the enterprises at all, because with every shift, a lot changes. The ecosystem changes. Everything that the individual takes away also changes. So there is something that we need to do, and it is not just about paying people more. I think that's a misnomer. It's environment, it's who you work with, it's the ecosystem, it's the whole structure, it is giving people career opportunities. That's making a difference more and more than ever before. And I think that's really the real case over here. Are organizations producing the next spate of leaders, or are organizations stuck with their leaders, not giving them opportunities to move and create others? So that's a big change that needs to happen. Declining patient satisfaction, we talked about. Eroding quality performances. We were just talking this afternoon that it is so important for this industry, and particularly for us at the IVF sector level. We don't really have an accreditation standard today. It's all going to be self-inflicted. And if we don't really start that process right now, somebody else will. So it's important to sort of start getting our facilities, our units accredited under some body or the other, which becomes the certificate of the basic quality standards that we are following. So important to be a part of that ecosystem rather than stay out of it and wait for somebody to actually come and put a regulatory influence around it. Media. I think media has been judging us more than ever before. And if you look at the last 2 years, the way that healthcare has actually been in the media, both for the good, for the bad, and for the average. I think for the first time, media is actually turning around and saying, if you're not doing something right, we will actually put you out. For a very long period of time, that was not really happening. So there is a lot of crucifixion that people believe is happening on account of media. But that's the real world that we are living in. And I think it's important for us to recognize that media is playing a very neutral role over here by not just projecting the good, but also taking out what patients want to hear. And there are a lot of stories out there which patients want to express of what they have gone through in enterprises. So again, something that we need to be super cognizant of, that this can make a massive shift and massive change. So let me come back to the last couple of points here, which are more financial, and I don't want to dwell into it. But what I want to take away over here this evening and what I want to leave you behind is that sector after sector has seen winds of change. And many of them actually come out much stronger, much more technologically advanced, much more nimble, much more agile every time when they see a change happen. I think healthcare, for the first time, is going through that shift. And it is very important for all of us to recognize this shift. As we go across the industry, and particularly since we have large portfolio of healthcare entities, we find so much resistance to change. We don't find the same kind of resistance to change in many of the other sectors. But we definitely find a lot of resistance to change in healthcare, and rightly so, because we've always been top-down in this sector, right? This is the sector where we have always been top-down, and the reason being that that's the only way that healthcare functions and works. It's directional. It's super directional. But the fact of the matter is that there are other industries which have seen that when change happens, you want to go and build better enterprises. You want to go and build more valuable enterprises. You want people connections of a very different kind, and you want to create top-class teams that can actually face these challenges and come out better. So, thank you very much for calling me here this evening. This was not supposed to be doomsday for the sector, but it was supposed to be a point of change. And somebody has to drive that, and somebody has to try and make it happen, because otherwise it hits really very hard. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening.